There have been many brutal and barbaric execution methods used throughout history. One of the most savage was hanging, drawing and quartering. This was used against traitors during the reign of King Henry VIII and others, and it was an execution which was in many stages. Onlookers would witness a bloodbath on the scaffold at sites such as Tyburn, but across the world there were many other barbaric execution methods used. These all had the same idea in mind, and that was to put possible criminals and offenders off committing crimes which were very serious. Authorities wanted to keep people away from a life of crime, and by showing the most brutal executions, it was meant to deter people. Guy Fawkes would be hanged, drawn and quartered to try and stop people dissenting and plotting against the king, but public executions were a form of sport and entertainment, and people would flock to see the condemned's ordeal. But one method of execution which was used throughout the centuries saw people passing under the decaying corpse and remains of someone every single day, for sometimes years. Gibbeting was a horrific way to meet your end, and there were some accounts of people being gibbeted alive. Join us today as we look at one of the most barbaric execution methods in history, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. The gibbet was usually a wooden structure in which a metal cage in the shape of a body could be hanged up to or hanged on, and the point of this was to show the remains of a dying criminal or a dead criminal for some time. It was known as being hanged in chains and was a punishment used in England, and following the passing of the 1751 Murder Act, judges were given the power to use gibbeting as a sentence passed upon those convicted of murder. There were many examples of other crimes in which someone would be gibbeted alive for, including theft and stealing sheep and piracy. It was also used for those condemned for treason, and was used for executing highwaymen, and these criminals' remains would be placed next to crossroads or public highways to put other potential thieves off committing crimes. Pirates were also gibbeted close to the low water mark or a tidal part of a river and on a river bank, so sailors would be greeted with the swinging bodies as they came into port. The bodies of pirates would be left dangling, and they would be left for days, until they were submerged by the tide at least 3 times. Others were left for some time in the gibbet. Execution Dock, which is found in London in the Wapping area, is where many criminals and pirates were hanged in cages along the River Thames. Ships would pass under the bodies of convicted pirates, and these would keep people in line. Some people did complain about the dead bodies hanging up in the cages because of the sight and smell of the decaying corpses, and they complained that these were actually a health hazard, and many believed that smells were linked to disease spreading. But others, such as foreign visitors, did not believe in the brutal display of the remains of someone. Sometimes with gibbeting, cages were not always used, but it was used to keep the condemned person locked in a cage. It was said of a gibbeting cage that the body was encased in flat bars of iron, 2.5 inches in breadth. The feet were placed in stirrups, from which a bar of iron went up each side of the head and ended in a ring, with which he was suspended. A bar from the collar went down the breast, another down the back. There were also bars inside the legs, which communicated with the above, and crossbars at the ankles, the knees, the thighs, the bows, the breast and shoulders. The hands were hung by the side and covered with pitch. The face was pitched and covered with a piece of white cloth. Gibbeting was of course also the display of human remains, and during the Tudor period, famously many heads of traitors were placed above London Bridge after they had their date with an executioner at Tower Hill. It was also used in different countries. For example, in Germany, a Jewish financier, Joseph Suss Oppenheimer, was gibbeted in a human-sized birdcage, which was then placed outside of Stuttgart. Hitler would later use this event to try and propagate stories against the Jews before the Second World War. Also, the bodies were often covered in tar and were bound in chains, and with the tarring of the victims, this was meant to keep away decay and to preserve the remains as long as possible. In East Sussex in England, one man who had murdered was hanged and then gibbeted for more than 20 years inside of an iron cage, with his remains continuing to be suspended in the air. But many of those inside of cities and towns would be taken aback by the sight of the dead hanging from the cages. In Australia, the body of a murderer named John Mackay was gibbeted close to a spot where he murdered his victim in Tasmania. This caused a lot of controversy, and the body would not be removed until a friend of the victim actually asked for it to be taken down, as he believed the decaying corpse was too much, and he believed he could not get over the death whilst the murderer's body remained suspended in the air. Some criminals were gibbeted alive, and they would be locked in the cage and then suspended in the air, and there was no way out for them. Over a long period of time, criminals would slowly die from starvation and exposure, as it was known, meaning exposure to the elements and the weather. People would walk past daily and would see the slow deterioration of the person as they lost weight and slowly succumbed to their painful death as people below mocked them. It was usually always men who were gibbeted, as female bodies of murderers were in high demand from doctors and surgeons who would carry out public dissections for science and medicine, and there were many people in the crowd who would then witness this. It was a popular way of seeing punishment being carried out, but often flies would feast on the rotting remains, as would crows, ravens and other animals. The smell would be terrible, and people nearby living near a gibbet had to keep their windows closed and shut, and the decay would often take place for many years. Bones of the condemned, once the flesh had been picked from them, would often fall onto the floor. There would be at times attempts to take someone out of the gibbet to spare them, but some blacksmiths made severe efforts to make sure the gibbet cage could not be opened. One gibbet was even covered with 12,000 nails to stop someone touching it. They were also very expensive to make. In England, the final gibbeting of someone took place in Leicester, as James Cook, a bookbinder, murdered another man. In front of Leicester Prison on the 10th of August 1832, he was executed, and it was then said that the head was shaved and tarred to preserve it from the action of the weather, and the cap in which he had suffered was drawn over his face. On Saturday afternoon his body, attired as at the same time of his execution, having been firmly fixed in the irons necessary to keep the limbs together, was carried to the place of its intended suspension. Cook's body was then placed on a specially built 10-metre high gallows near to a toll gate in Leicester, and it was said of his gibbeting, thousands of persons were attracted to the spot to view this novel but most barbarous exhibition, and considerable annoyance was felt by persons resident in the neighbourhood of the dreadful scene. Representations were in consequence made to the authorities, and on the following Tuesday morning, instructions were received from the Home Office directing the removal of the gibbet. Gibbeting was one of the most barbaric and brutal practices used in history. There were many who would witness a public display of the remains of a criminal. It was meant to serve as a painful reminder that justice had been done, and was meant to keep people off committing crimes. But it was considered by some to be too far, and if you passed under the gibbet cage, you would not forget what you saw, and it might keep you up at night. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.